Most people never think about Moldova. And honestly, many people in Europe barely think about it either. Hidden between Romania and Ukraine, this small country is mostly known for one thing: being called Europe's poorest country. No famous cities. No huge tourism industry. Almost no global attention. But the strange part is, Moldova doesn't feel the way people expect. Yes, there are abandoned villages, old Soviet architecture, and signs of poverty left behind after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But there are also modern cafés in Chișinău, enormous underground wine tunnels, and younger generations trying to rebuild something different between Russia and the European Union. And that's what makes Moldova so difficult to explain. Because this isn't just a story about economics. It's a story about identity, post-Soviet life, and a country trapped between different versions of Europe, still trying to figure out what it wants to become. The forgotten country of Europe. There are countries in Europe people dream about visiting, and then there's Moldova. This small nation in Eastern Europe exists almost quietly, far from the attention given to the rest of Europe. No beaches, no famous landmarks, no major tourism industry. Just a country many outsiders rarely notice. And that invisibility slowly became part of its identity. Walking through Chișinău feels strangely confusing at times. Old Soviet architecture still dominates entire neighborhoods, while abandoned villages and rough rural roads make parts of the country feel frozen in another era. But beside the gray apartment blocks and younger generations create a completely different atmosphere. Moldova never fully looks the way people imagine Europe's poorest country should look. That contradiction comes from history. Moldova spent centuries between Romanian influence and Russian control before becoming part of the Soviet Union. Then, after the Soviet collapse in 1991, the Moldovan economy suddenly fell apart, and the consequences would reshape the country for decades. The country where people had to leave. One of Moldova's biggest exports slowly became its own people. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, thousands of families realized the Moldovan economy could no longer offer stability. Young adults began leaving for Italy, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom, chasing salaries impossible to find inside Europe's poorest country. In many villages, the silence started growing louder than the people who once lived there. Over time, migration stopped feeling temporary. Entire communities were left with elderly grandparents raising children while parents worked abroad for years at a time. In some parts of Moldova, abandoned houses became so common they almost blended into the landscape. And yet, the country itself became deeply dependent on the money sent back home. Part of life in Moldova was now surviving outside Moldova. For younger generations, leaving no longer felt like ambition. It felt expected, almost inevitable. But despite decades of poverty and separation, the country still carried traces of something older. Something the Soviet era had never fully erased. A country still living in the shadow of the Soviet Union. In Moldova, the Soviet Union never fully disappeared. Across Chișinău, massive Soviet architecture still shapes the skyline, while old monuments and gray apartment blocks quietly remind people of a system that collapsed decades ago. Russian is still widely spoken beside Romanian, and many older generations still carry habits, memories, and fears shaped by post-Soviet life. But the deeper divide is political and emotional. Part of the country looks toward the European Union, hoping modernization will finally pull Moldova forward. Another part still feels culturally connected to Russia and the Soviet past. That tension becomes impossible to ignore inside Transnistria, a separatist region with its own government, military, currency, and even Lenin statues still standing in public squares. To outsiders, Moldova looks like one small country. Internally, though, it often feels trapped between different identities, different eras, and different versions of Europe. And after the Ukrainian war began, that fragile balance suddenly became much harder to maintain. The war in Ukraine and the fear of being caught in the middle. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Moldova suddenly felt exposed. This small country in Eastern Europe depended heavily on regional trade, energy, fuel, and transportation routes connected to its neighbors. Almost overnight, prices began rising across the Moldovan economy. Inflation surged, energy costs exploded, and uncertainty spread through daily life in Moldova in a way many people hadn't felt for years. But the real tension was psychological. Moldova has no major military power. For many Moldovans, the Ukrainian war forced an uncomfortable question back into public conversation. What happens if the conflict moves closer? At the same time, the government under Maia Sandu pushed harder toward the European Union, hoping Western integration could offer stability and protection. Moldova was no longer just struggling with poverty or post-Soviet life anymore. It was now trying to decide where it truly belonged politically and historically. The side of Moldova almost nobody expects. But Moldova isn't only gray apartment blocks, poverty, or geopolitical tension. In fact, one of the strangest things about life in Moldova is how calm and welcoming the country can feel once people actually spend time there. The streets of Chișinău are surprisingly green and quiet, while many visitors describe the country as one of the safest places they've experienced in Eastern Europe. Beyond the old Soviet architecture, there's also a strong sense of tradition that never fully disappeared. Orthodox Christianity still shapes everyday life, rural communities remain deeply connected, and Moldova's wine culture quietly became one of the country's greatest symbols. Massive underground wine cities like Craiova and Mălăștii Măsii stretch for kilometers beneath the ground, almost hidden beneath a country most people barely think about. That contrast is everywhere. Modern cafés sit beside decaying Soviet buildings. Young people dream about the European Union, while older generations remember the Soviet Union with nostalgia. Moldova constantly feels suspended between collapse and reinvention, which may be exactly why the country feels so difficult to fully understand. Moldova's real problem may not be poverty. At some point, Moldova stops feeling like just a story about economics. Yes, it's still called Europe's poorest country, and yes, many families continue dealing with migration, low salaries, and uncertainty. But underneath those problems, there's a deeper feeling running through the country, the sense that Moldova is still trying to decide what it actually is. Part of the population looks toward the European Union and imagines a different future connected to the West. Another part still feels emotionally tied to Russia, post-Soviet life, and older ideas of stability. Romanian influence exists beside Soviet nostalgia, often inside the same family. And for many younger people, the future feels easier to imagine somewhere else entirely. That may be Moldova's biggest struggle of all. When generations grow up believing opportunity only exists abroad, rebuilding national identity becomes incredibly difficult. Moldova doesn't feel like a country that fully collapsed. It feels more like a country permanently stuck between different worlds, still unfinished, still searching, still changing. At some point, this stops being just about poverty. It becomes something much deeper. Because when you really look at Moldova, what stands out isn't only the abandoned villages, the Soviet architecture, or the economic struggle. It's the feeling of a country still living between different worlds. Between Russia and the European Union. Between Romanian influence and the legacy of the Soviet Union. Between the people trying to leave and the people still trying to rebuild. Maybe that's why Moldova feels so difficult to define. Not because it's Europe's poorest country, but because it still feels unfinished. You can see it in Chișinău, in Transnistria, in the quiet villages losing population year after year. A country shaped by migration, uncertainty, and post-Soviet life, still searching for stability, identity, and direction. And maybe that's the real question here. What happens to a country when generations grow up believing the future exists somewhere else? And what happens to national identity when a country spends decades caught between different histories, cultures, and political worlds? Because once you start understanding Moldova, you stop seeing it as just another small country in Eastern Europe. It becomes a glimpse into what happens after an empire disappears. And if you enjoy discovering hidden realities and exploring the overlooked side of Europe, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because on Inside Europe, the goal isn't just to show you Europe, it's to understand the stories hiding beneath it.